Welcome to the third lesson in our series on crafting effective sentences. Today we're going to look at using a series of dependent clauses either at the beginning of a sentence or at the end of the sentence to create a very solid thesis or claim statement. So what I want to do first is kind of talk about where we are right now. This is the third in a series, and the first three lessons are dealing with building a really effective thesis statement or claim statement, trying to do something that's a little beyond the expected, a little beyond the ordinary. And this third model is the third and probably last one that we'll talk about as far as making an effective claim. The other parts of our series, the other lessons, will deal with crafting sentences that are good for details, sentences that are good for conclusions, sentences even that are good for transitions. So let's look at what this model looks like. So first of all, dependent clauses in a series don't get wrapped up so much in the terminology. To be dependent means that you depend on something else that's of a higher rank than you. And so what happens in a dependent clause is its meaning is taken from the larger main clause, which is the big part of the sentence. Think of it more as like a detail or adding some kind of color to your painting. And so as you begin to practice with these ways to craft sentences, you may want to consider, and this is why this pattern is very good for this, how rhythm and sound can impact your thesis statement. And if nothing else, this particular model creates a rhythm for you that allows the reader to kind of ease into your topic, and then it also allows you a vehicle to kind of launch into your body paragraphs. So this pattern will heavily use parallel structure as well as repetition of words or phrases to help create that rhythm. And that rhythm comes from the repetition, it comes from the sounds, and it comes how those things are all put together in this final form. This pattern is flexible enough so that you can use it either at the beginning of your sentence or at the end of your sentence. So let's take a look at what it looks like kind of mathematically. The dependent clause begins with a single word or sometimes a couple of words that usually put it into its dependency. So a word like if, a word like because, a word like after, a word like when. Those are words that we use to give greater detail to the sentence. They depend on our main subject and verb, to get their meaning. Okay, so our pattern looks like this, and you don't have to use specifically the words if. You can use a word like after. You can use a word like because. If this, if that, if this, then, and your subject and verb. When this occurs, and when this occurs, then you know this. So you can also move this to the end position where you put your subject and verb, your main clause first, and then you have your details after that. Now, there's no magic to the number 3. Sometimes 2 works better and more effectively than 3. I wouldn't do more than 3 of these dependent clauses because then it starts to get really unwieldy. So you might find a different pattern to work with that. Our major mark of punctuation for this is going to be the comma. Okay, so let's look at an example. I'm going to give you, as always, 2 examples, talk you through each of them, and then so you'll be able to kind of create your own. And if you'd like, you can find this resource as well as lots of others along with this video at our website, eliteliterarybookgroup.com. So if you visit there, you'll see a wealth of resources that you can make use of. So here's a couple of examples. I'm going to use the word after to begin my dependent clause. After we learn to consider the other, after we learn to lift that other up, after we realize the other's success is our own, only then is harmony possible. And then our second example is I'm going to move it to the end of the sentence. School violence decimates a community because it takes its lives, because it takes its security, and because it takes its hope. So let's look at that first sentence first. And by beginning the sentence in this way with 3, in this case I'm beginning with 3 dependent clauses, I've set up a nice parallel structure. After we, and again you see that repetition. After we learn to consider the other, after we learn to lift up the other, after we realize. And so you've got a nice little parallel structure. Again, it's a rhythm that you're falling into. So you want to be careful as you're doing these to the length of those dependent clauses. You don't want one of them way out of line with the others. And so one of the things that this does is, like the previous lesson, it sets up what your body paragraphs are going to be about. So what that means is that you have to begin to pay very close attention to how you are ordering these dependent clauses. You want to make sure you're building towards something significant. Not that other details are minor, but you really want to use your final clause as being kind of like your strongest point that you want to make. So let's look at the second example. This is where I've used the dependent clauses at the end. And you'll see the repetition. You'll hear how I'm using a set of 3 words, okay, actually 4 words. School violence decimates a community because it takes its lives, because it takes its security, and because it takes its hope. So, because it takes its, that's my repetition, that's my rhythm that I'm creating. And you'll notice I haven't gone overboard with adding anything after that other than the noun, lives, security, and hope. Okay, so what I've got now, and again, I want you to pay attention to the order here. It's not that lives are less important. It's not that security is less important. But I think if I really want to convince my audience, that final point I want to make might be about how it robs a community of hope, which is the way it looks toward its future, which may be the most devastating part of what happens after a school shooting or some kind of school violence takes place. So why is this an effective model? One of the things that happens when you use this pattern is it forces you to pay attention to the rhythm of your sentences. It forces you to pay attention to how you're putting details together. So when you are conscious of like creating a parallel structure, you're conscious of how many sounds, how many words am I putting in each of these parts, in each of these little compartments of my sentence, and am I contributing or taking away from the rhythm? Because I've managed to put all of these points into a single sentence rather than putting them in multiple sentences. In each of those examples I gave you, what I could have done was try to frame each of those points, each of my dependent clauses, as part of one single sentence, and then just kind of put them in a row. So instead of a single thesis, I might actually have like 3 sentences that serve as a thesis for me, which is perfectly acceptable, but I think this compactness of style is a better way to write it. Okay, so again, it shows that you can be a concise writer and that you can take something that's maybe a little bit unwieldy and put it together and offer an abbreviated, even lyrical sounding single sentence. All right, so that's our lesson for today. Again, you can find a lot of these resources, all of these resources, on eliteliterarybookgroup.com. One thing I will remind you when constructing these sentences, as always, this is meant for the revision part of it. If it pops out in your first draft, that's great. Don't expect it to until you've practiced these for quite a while and your writing gets stronger and stronger. Don't be discouraged if the sentences that we're doing, don't come naturally to you. And that's the purpose of doing this practice, this exercise, kind of creating that muscle memory that you need as a writer. So becoming an effective writer requires time because it demands patience and because it demands attention to craft. So right there, that final sentence, you've noticed I've used 2, and I've used it almost not as a thesis statement. But it could also serve as a concluding statement. All right, that's all for now. We'll see you next time.